Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I have a very special guest with me tonight, and the poor thing was out at an event, and he didn't get a chance to eat. So if you see him eating and drinking, I'd like to introduce you to David Zuckerman, who is the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Vermont, and he's currently running for governor. How are you doing tonight, David?
I'm good. I've had a long day. I get up around 5:30 to get the farm going. I'm also an organic farmer, vegetables, chickens, and pigs. And today the legislature is back in session, so I was down in Montpelier middle of the day, and then this evening I've had three runs in a row, and this is the third one. So I'm a little tired, but that's the day in the life these days when you're running for office and running a farm. And I'm fully here. Glad to be here.
Okay, well, I've got a good list of questions lined up for you, so let's get right into them.
Sure.
So you were, before you were lieutenant governor, you were in the state legislature for 14 years, and you first ran as a student at the University of Vermont, where you were inspired by Bernie Sanders, like so many young people are today. Tell us, what was that like? And also, what was the centerpiece of your campaign when you were that young?
Wow. So I was pretty active on campus, particularly around environmental issues. I'd helped organize the 20th anniversary of Earth Day back in 1990 in the spring of my freshman year at UVM, University of Vermont. And I, as an activist around, particularly, like I said, environmental issues, but then through student clubs, really started to really see how so many of the other issues were connected, and started really networking with folks who are working on economic injustice, but also particularly racial injustice and some gender issues on campus. And we were trying to work together where you might be focused in, quote, your area of passion, but we would in solidarity show up at other groups' events so that we would amplify each other's voices. And I always felt like the way to make change was through organizing and community building and community organizing, and that the political world was not of interest to me because it was so corporate paid off. It was so talking head political and insulated, powerful people that it didn't really appeal to me. And in 1992, Bernie came to campus, and he was running for Congress. It was his first re-election. I wish I'd brought one of my 1992 Bernie pins that I still have. And here was an independent, so he was not part of the corporate part of the political process. He didn't take corporate donations. He, as you all know now, he says exactly what he thinks. He's very robust about it, very straightforward on the issues and the injustices that are happening in society. And he was talking much the same tune back then. And I thought, wow, here is someone who somehow is in the system and is able to maintain his fight, his organizing, his passion for the issues. And so I volunteered on his campaign. And that fall, I was one of, if not the lead campus organizer at UVM. We door knocked all the dorms. We tabled at the library. We registered over 1,000 students to vote that year, which back then was really quite a big number because young people didn't get involved as they have more recently, in large part because of Bernie, and now also with Black Lives Matter and the realization that if we don't get involved, we're in big trouble. And from there, I met local people, and those local people were involved in affordable housing. They were involved in gender issues and marriage equality in their community and in their work. And so they got involved politically when it was electoral season, but they also lived their lives in activism and in professional endeavors that were related to building our community and improving our community. And that was the group that I started to be affiliated with. And you said it in 1994. One of the other folks who was in office asked me to run. I hadn't thought of running. I didn't jump in. Usually men are like, hey, I'm going to run for office. I wasn't there yet. But another candidate asked me to run with him in a 2-seat district, and I was still a student. And I did lose. I lost by 59 votes back in 1994. I was 23 years old that fall. but came back 2 years later. And as you said, 14 years in the House. I also served 4 years in the Senate before being lieutenant governor for 4 years. Whoops.
In your 14 years in the legislature, what were your signature issues? And what are the bills that you were able to get passed that you're most proud of?
Wow. Well, first, I feel really lucky that I represented a district where I could push the envelope. It was a university district and the neighboring part of the community. And so I felt, as someone who was serving as a member of a third party, the Progressive Party, and was serving in a district where one could push issues and widen the conversation, that I should put in such bills. My first campaign, as well as my second, and I've still been working on it to this day, was around cannabis reform, because of both the health potential, the racial injustice and civil rights injustices of cannabis illegal and the war on drugs, and the Nixon years and what they did around the war movement and the civil rights movement. And as a college student, I did participate in consuming cannabis. And I learned about all those historical pieces all the way back to the 30s and the racism of, associating it with Mexicans. And I mean, if you want to know the history, go look, but there's a lot there. So I worked a lot on cannabis reform and led Vermont's efforts through the process, including in 2003, passing the first medical cannabis law through a legislative process in the country. It had been done by referendum in other states. But at that time, the Vermont House was Republican, the Vermont Senate was Democrat, and the governor was Republican. And as a progressive, I helped lead that bill through that process, and we got it into law. So that was something where, with community organizing, we got that done. But also, the bills that I have even more, I don't know what the right word is, almost relief, but also pride is such a hard word, but feeling about, was that when Vermont passed civil unions in 2000, I was one of the few legislators that voted for full-on marriage equality, not just civil unions. And then in 2005, I was the lead sponsor of Vermont's first full marriage equality bill with 5 other people. And then in 2008, when we passed it, I had introduced a bill, but the speaker had asked if one of the Democrats could be the lead sponsor. And so I gave in to be the second sponsor, because it was a Democratic majority, and the goal is to pass the bills. And if that's what was going to make them happy, I would rather the policy pass than whatever notoriety someone gets, because it's more important to do it. And the reason I feel so good about things like marriage equality, end-of-life choices I worked on for 9 years, GMO labeling. Vermont was the only state in the country, the first state in the country to pass a GMO labeling law. That was in 2014. But I had first introduced those bills in 1999. It was 15 years after I started talking about GMOs that we got GMO labeling passed. And what is so satisfying about passing those kinds of bills, even though it took longer, was that I did it by traveling the state, meeting in living rooms and coffee shops and church basements and library meeting rooms, organizing with people so that they would call their legislators and influence their legislators from the grassroots up. And then in the legislature, those legislators would come to me and say, David, I've got a constituent. They're asking me about GMOs and I don't know anything about it. I know you're the GMO guy. So can you tell me something so I can tell them? And internally, I would think it worked. I've got that legislator coming to me to learn how to satisfy his constituents' needs, which means he will now, or she will now, trust me and work with me on passing this legislation. So when we do it organizing in the grassroots way, in collaboration with a couple of key legislators, it actually builds up those legislators' collaborative authority in the building to get it done. And when, like with end-of-life choices, or with marriage equality, or with cannabis, when someone comes up to me and says, my mother or father utilized that law with end-of-life choices, and we were all there, and it was so peaceful. Or when a couple is married and they say, thank you, we now are validated by society because of the work you did. or someone uses medical cannabis and says, this has prolonged my life or alleviated some of my PTSD or other things. It's those moments that that make me feel good about what I've done more than a title of a bill or a big hallmark. It's the individual connection that
Right.
makes this worth it.
Right. So let's talk about GMOs, because that's been an issue that I've been involved in as an activist. In fact, I remember lobbying my Senator Dianne Feinstein to vote against the new DARK Act, which was practically made the Vermont bill. It kind of overturned or superseded the Vermont bill. And that was a bipartisan thing between the Republican chairman, Pat Roberts, and the Democratic ranking member, Debbie Stabenow. And I never forget that effort. But specifically about GMOs and Vermont, I want to take a question and relate it to your work as a farmer. I'm a member of the Organic Farming Association. The Organic Consumer Association. And I organized a protest for them a few years back against Ben & Jerry. And it was at the Santa Monica ice cream store, because Ben & Jerry's does not use organic milk. Now they're using it apparently for 1 or 2 flavors, but they do not buy organic milk. And they are the largest buyers of milk in the state of Vermont. And a lot of organic dairy farmers are saying that this is putting them out of business because Ben & Jerry's don't buy from them. Lake Champlain is being polluted from runoff from the Roundup that's used on the non-GMO fields that the cows eat. And worse than that, traces of glyphosate was found in several ice cream flavors, which is why they were trying to do this campaign and thus the protest that I organized. Now, I talked to Ben Cohen about this because I was covering a money out of politics thing, and he tried to say that he was no longer involved with the company, that he had sold it to Unilever, but he was still on the board. And apparently this is something that predates them selling the company to Unilever, them not using organic milk. So I want to ask you, as a farmer who makes his living from farming, and also as a politician who has to answer to a lot of farmers who are business people, how do you square, and this is like, as an activist, and you remember this, being an activist, you can be really pure to be on one side or the other, but when you're a politician, you have to balance these different interests. In this issue of, Ben & Jerry's, and you can see why they don't do it, because it's more expensive. But then you've got the conventional dairy farmers here, the organic dairy farmers there, you've got the environment, you've got the health. What is your position on this issue, and how do you navigate those kind of waters?
Well, there's a lot there. There's a couple things, and there's some great activists in Vermont who want state government to basically push all dairy in Vermont to be organic tomorrow. And there's a combination of realities here that it would be ideally, I think all farming would move towards organic farming, which is what it was before, in the 1800s and early 1900s, before all the World War II factories had to produce something. So they started producing the conventional fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. And in some respects, we are moving in that direction. I think it's going to happen more due to economic pressure than it is political pressure, because the conventional prices are so low that the conventional dairies are basically going to either go out of business selling commodity milk, or they're going to have to change their practices. The other practical reality, though, is if tomorrow we said all milk in Vermont has to be produced organically, the organic market would be glutted and the price would drop, because there's not enough people yet buying organic milk for all of Vermont's milk to suddenly be organic. And that's also true with ice cream. They tried to run a broader line of organic ice cream, and the price point was just too high for the majority of consumers. As many people know, Ben & Jerry's ice cream is already quite a bit more expensive for a pint than a lot of other varieties of ice cream. And on the organic side, it was going to be yet more. And so there's a limited population of people that will buy it. So what I'd like to see us do, and some will consider this political or not, it's fine however you want to interpret it, but the state does put a lot of money into water quality cleanup, or farm supports for buffer areas between the open field crops of corn and the edges of rivers where you might have, a buffer area of grasses to try to reduce runoff. We could certainly use some of those resources to add more to incent people to do better practices and to move towards converting or towards less use of some of those chemicals and or GMO seeds. But it's also got to be done in a way that builds the market. Because if there isn't a market for the product, the farms aren't going to make money doing it any other way than the way they're already doing it. So it's a dual approach where consumers have to not only demand it as activists, but you have to demand it with your dollars. And that, along with state regulations and or support structures to convert. So what I'd like to see us do, and I've talked about this for years, is instead of Vermont producing commodity milk, where if Vermont stopped producing milk tomorrow, the country wouldn't even notice. Because it's huge to Vermont, but we're only 1% of the nation's milk, 1.2%. But if we created a Vermont brand of milk that started moving towards better animal husbandry practices and we have a lot of worker rights issues with migrant workers on our farms. And we said, if you buy this milk for $1 more a gallon, that will mean we're using fewer of these chemicals on our fields, or the animals are out on pasture more and we're doing rotational grazing or regenerative agriculture, or the workers are getting better hours or better pay. And we could start to generate a positive loop for the farmers to keep improving their practices. That's the direction I would go.
Great. I want to talk about another issue that you ran on in '94. I thought you would mention it because it came up in some of your speeches as a student, and that is the corrupting influence of money in politics. And you might have noticed that, well, you probably didn't watch my show, but you might have heard that Brent Welder, who was a Sanders appointed member of the Rules Committee, tried to pass a rule that the DNC would not take corporate PAC money and they would not have corporate lobbyists serve on their board. And they got outvoted by the Biden delegates. It was really a terrible story. So seeing as we can't count on the top of the ticket to support our call to get rid of the corrupting influence of money in politics, what ideas are you proposing for doing it on the state level? And can I assume that you don't take corporate money yourself?
You can accurately assume that for sure. Yes, I do not take any corporate donations.
So what are your ideas for how we, because I know Maine has tried,
Maine is doing it at the legislative level where they publicly finance the legislative races. In Vermont, many years ago, we did succeed. I helped with that effort to create public financing for the governor's race and the lieutenant governor's race. We've since learned that the parameters of what you have to meet do not really fit within the practicalities of running. So it's difficult. We did have one candidate run with public financing under the progressive label many years ago. I, in my first bid for lieutenant governor, started down the path of public financing, but you couldn't raise or spend more than $500 prior to, I think it was February 15th of the election year. And someone else had started running in the summer. So when I announced that I was running in December and suddenly raised more than $500, I became disqualified from being able to do public financing. So we sued to try to get that part of the law thrown out, which is funny because we helped write the law. But at the time, races had been shorter, 6 and 8 years earlier. And then more recently, a couple of years ago, we doubled the amount of money. So one running for governor could raise $600,000 through public financing to spend on one's race. And the past couple races in Vermont have been about $1 million, but 600,000, you could run a very robust race. But I would like to see us continue to expand that and make that a more parallel amount of money. And then also look at, we've worked on laws, we've never gotten them passed yet, to ban corporate donations all across the board. There are some Supreme Court decisions that make that more difficult to get into law. But I'd like to see us do more in the arena of public financing so that more people can get in. I mean, one of the biggest barriers for women, for our BIPOC communities and others is raising money. If you're not, white men own most of the country. So of course, white men donate to white men. And then how do other people who don't come from societies or parts of society that have wealth, raise the money to run a competitive race. The only way it's been done is through phenomenal grassroots organizing. And we've seen that in a few places where the establishment was upended. I mean, Jamal Bowman was a great example of that, but that's the exception. It's not the norm. And if we want a wider range of people in office, I happen to think public financing is probably the biggest way to restore democracy to a true everybody being able to engage and or run and or participate of almost any measure that we could do. But unfortunately, the corporate side really does dominate the political scene.
Yes, and now we have corporate Democrats who seem to be dominating our party, with the exception of people like Jamal and Cori Bush had a good win, and increasing the numbers of people in the squad. I want to ask you about another issue that I know is really important to you, and that's Medicare for all. That's another thing that Joe Biden won't support and they don't have in the Democratic Party platform, but it's something that you guys were able to pass in Vermont. Peter Shumlin, who was the governor at the time, purportedly supported it, but then he dropped it. And now he's trotted out by all the Democrats to show why it won't work. So maybe you could give us the inside story, since you were involved in it, on really why single payer didn't work in Vermont, and why, as governor, what changes you would make to the bill so that it would work, because I assume you're running on it.
Well, we're certainly talking about, at this point, universal primary care and trying to get to universal health care through a phased-in approach, because unfortunately now that what happened under the Shumlin administration, it's really made a wide range of Vermonters sort of, shock shy of going all the way in one big step. And what ultimately happened was his administration, and I don't know the insides of the room machinations and the number crunching that they came up with, but they came up with a figure that they would require a payroll tax of between, I think it was 11 and 13% in order to fund a universal healthcare system. And they thought that that was politically unpalatable. And so while they were supporting the idea and they were doing the work to get there, once they came up with that number, which again, I don't know what they put into the pot to make the number 11 to 13%, they felt that they couldn't quite pull the political trigger to go for it. Now, as Bernie has pointed out many times, you end up with a payroll tax, but then everybody gets to eliminate the private premiums, the private tax for healthcare. And when you look at how much people are paying in premiums, even through Obamacare, through businesses that pay for it for their employees, it is often easily 9, 11, and 15% of one's income or payroll. And so what's shocking is, as often is the case, the facts are there, but the rhetoric so easily and simply defeats the public mindset of the possibility that as political leaders, you get hamstrung, because while you want to do it, ultimately, believe it or not, even some of the corporate backed folks, they do get calls from their constituents, and they hear more from those folks that buy into the fear and the scare tactics, and they get cold feet. And so I think in that bill, it ultimately came down to, it was there, it was possible, and it was cold feet at the end. So I think if we can prove, one of the things that Bernie did back when he first became mayor of Burlington back in the early 80s, was he found all these inefficiencies because the same people had been running government forever, that they were set in their ways. And so one of the opportunities when you have a new lens at looking at things, the way I will as governor and he did as mayor, is you find all these old contracts that are kind of a little puffy. And if you find the more efficient way to do it, you free up money. And when you free up money, you use that money to create either the new programs or to make the new programs less of a sticker shock. And so what I'd like to do is a universal primary care program. And I've talked to some really progressive businesses up here in Vermont who have started doing it on their own, out of their own pocket. They are creating universal primary care for their employees in collaboration with a couple other businesses. And they're seeing their healthcare bills go down as businesses because all their employees go in as soon as they're sick, and they find illness earlier. And so the overall bill to cure the illnesses are often much smaller. And so the investment that they're making in a universal primary care system for their employees is often paying back in just a couple of years, maybe 3 years, to where the return on investment is greater than their cost. And so if they can do it, then we can do it, especially on a bigger scale.
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to start it off. I want to ask you about a couple of controversial issues that I don't see on your issues page, and these are issues that kind of tripped Bernie up in the past. One is defense. We know that the F-35 fighter plane is produced in Vermont, and Bernie's always been a supporter of it, and he's always been picketed by the peace activists because of it. What is your position? And, you know, somebody, I don't remember who said it was, they were very smart. They managed to put a defense plant in almost every congressional district. Even Barbara Boxer, who was a very progressive, I'm not so much anymore, but she was very progressive as a senator. Even she supported our defense industry in California. What is your position on that particular, you know, fighter plane and on defense in general? And do you have much say in that as governor of, yeah.
Well, I think it was Eisenhower who might have been talking about the military-industrial complex and how wise they were, but it might have been somebody else. By basically,
he actually said his initial quote was the military-industrial congressional complex.
Well,
but then he was persuaded to take out congressional. Go on.
Right. So, you know, basically every congressional district in the country has either an armaments type manufacturing facility, or, you know, Susan Collins with the Bath Iron Works and all the shipbuilding going on that basically run her senatorial funding situation. So a few things. One is, as a representative and then senator, I was vocally quite opposed to the F-35s. And I was probably the highest ranking elected person speaking out against basing of the F-35s here. I thought there were alternative missions that we could have had at our airport here in Burlington. It's one of the most populated Guard bases with the F-35s anywhere in the country, as far as the noise and the impact. So I spoke out quite vehemently against it, and in fact, helped with some of the rallies that were held at all of our congressional delegations' offices. That battle we lost. I mean, it was years long, and we lost it as activists, and with me as a legislator. We, at one point, I think, even tried to get a resolution in the legislature. I don't believe I got it passed. And then now, as lieutenant governor, I have sort of no say over it at all. As governor, one is the commander of the Guard, but the planes are now here. So then the question is, what say does the governor have over the use of those planes? And in many respects, it's fairly limited. On the other hand, I know that many people felt like right when COVID started, they could have been flying less, and we could have been using our Guard resources more for food distribution and, you know, other supports for people. And so, you know, those are some areas we could look at. But as far as ultimately getting them removed, that has not been a topic I've been talking about, because I don't really think it's possible. But I did speak out against them quite a bit when I was a representative and senator.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think we need to have a Department of Peace. You know, I think calling it the Defense Department is really a misnomer. It should be called the Department of War. And what we need is a Department of Peace. And I don't think there's any chance that Biden is going to start one. But another issue is gun rights and the Second Amendment. We all know, and this is something that Bernie was also dinged on, and he was dinged on it by establishment Democrats. You know, people who were running against him in 2016 for a couple of votes that he had that didn't seem, you know, totally 100% gun control. But you have a lot of sportsmen in Vermont, and a lot of libertarian types that, you know, really support their right to bear arms. What is your position on that issue, and how do you navigate it when you're trying to get the votes of those people?
Well, there's a couple different things. You know, most gun owners actually do support sensible gun laws and gun violence prevention laws. I think even in Vermont, the support for a waiting period to purchase a gun is up in the 80% range. So the positions of the majority of voters has really shifted over these last 20 years. I think that's one of the challenges with someone like Bernie. It's a challenge with me. I've now been in office starting 22 years ago, 24 years ago. And when you've been in office that long, some of the sentiment of the public also changes. So you might have been a leader on something in the day, but not on everything. And you voted with you thought was the majority opinion and the somewhat rational position at the time. And then now it's held against you. So Vermont, folks should know that with respect to Bernie and those who attacked him for that, Vermont, when he was first a congressman, was a very strong gun rights state, both the Second Amendment of the US Constitution and the Article 16 of the state constitution. And Vermont had some of the most gun-friendly laws in the country, literally until 2 years ago. You can conceal carry without a permit. You can, I believe, open carry. And there were almost no restrictions at all in Vermont up until just a couple of years ago. Some of the things that I'd like to still see us do is the current governor vetoed a 24-hour waiting period. Again, the majority of Vermonters support that, including many gun owners, including in rural areas. And then closing the Charleston loophole, which some people may know that term, some may not. I don't know, Lauren, are you familiar with that term?
No.
So the Charleston loophole is based on the fact that when you get a background check, and you're supposed to wait, I think it's 3 days for the background check to clear. If after 3 days it is not cleared, but you've also not been denied, then you're allowed to buy a gun. So if the system is bogged down, or if I think it's the FBI, but if it's whoever it is, ATF, that's reviewing the documents, takes too long, then you can have a reason not to buy a gun on your record, and yet you can still buy a gun because you've reached the term limit of 3 days or whatever it is. So that's how the gun was purchased for the Charlestown massacre. The guy who bought those guns got through this loophole. So there's the legislative discussion of you can't buy a gun until you are approved through the background check, as opposed to until you're either approved or your application expires over 3 days. So those are a couple of policies that I would like to see us explore. And I may lose some votes for that, but neither of those things are so damning. If you have a right to get a gun, you'll get a gun through both of those issues.
Okay, the next thing I wanted to ask you about was education, because you have, an education position on your page, but it doesn't say anything about charter schools. And that's something that I'm very active in. What is your position on charter schools, or are they not a thing in Vermont?
They're not really a thing in Vermont. I'm not a fan of charter schools. I'm a strong supporter of public education. Vermont has a really curious hybrid education system, however, because each town can choose whether they want to operate an operated public school, either K through 6, K through 8, or K through 12. Some only operate a high school and don't operate elementary schools. And if they don't operate a school, they can then use their public dollars to designate either a neighboring public school for their kids to go to, or a designated independent school in some instances. So we've got a very hybrid system. There's a lot of towns in Vermont that don't have a public school system, but charter schools have not really taken off in Vermont, and I'm not a big fan of charter schools. I'm a big fan of public school because I think it's really the great equalizer, or potential equalizer, in society in terms of opportunity for people. And a few years ago, when I was on the education committee in the Senate for 4 years, we really dug into all the ways that the private schools don't have to meet the same criteria of accepting every student, of meeting the needs of kids with special needs, of supplying transportation to get kids to school. And so they can operate a less expensive system because they also don't have to meet the needs of the broader society.
Right.
And public school is there for every single kid. And that's critically important because every kid deserves a chance.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it, because that's where I stand too.
Yeah.
Now, there are three issues that are really signature issues for 2020 that I'm sure are going to be foremost on people's minds when they go to the polls in November. One of them is COVID, the pandemic, obviously. And the other is the economy, which is affected by COVID, people losing their jobs, small businesses going under, and then that snowballs into housing, people worried about being able to pay their mortgage, being able to pay their rent and evictions. And then the third thing is the defund the police movement with all the protests. Now, I know that you don't have a large minority population in Vermont, but what are your positions on those three issues?
Well, a few things. And this is an interesting one because in my campaign to unseat our Republican governor and become the governor of Vermont, I will say the governor's done a reasonably good job. And the RGA has already seen me say this. So if they're filming this, they'll take it again and they'll clip it and they'll say, see, he even thinks the governor's doing a good job. He has done a relatively good job. He's also been fortunate in that Vermont has a very community-minded population. And so people were immediately very much wearing masks, spatially distancing, and the governor took good early steps. The other thing is we don't have a major city. We don't have, those dense populations where it was much more likely to spread. And in fact, some of our worst outbreaks were from a basketball game where there was a dense population and watching the game, and some of the senior centers, just like everywhere else. So I would do things probably fairly similarly to what our current governor did, which is listen to the medical experts, listen to the scientists, listen as we're learning the epidemiology of how it spreads and what we need to do to keep it from spreading. But there are a few things I would have done differently during the course of it, which was that early on, our unemployment system was swamped, and it took 4 weeks before the governor really did anything serious. And he did it 2 days after I wrote a letter that said, hey, why don't we get the National Guard in, take the names and the social security numbers and the address of anybody who's not getting through unemployment, and at least just mail them a check for now. Get them some money so that they can put food on their table. It's been a month since they were at work. They got to pay bills, put food on the table for their kids and their spouse and whomever else. And then we can square up how much money they got in advance once we get them through the system. And they're going to be on the system for a while because this is not going to go away. Plus, they've already been lost 3 or 4 weeks. So there's no way that a $500 or $1,000 check was going to upend the system. So he finally reacted after I wrote a letter and sent that out to my email lists all across the state after sending it to the Commissioner of Labor. But that would have been very different. I also would have in May started talking immediately about outdoor education. I would have said, let's have our fall school season start with outdoor education. Let's just tell teachers right now, plan to be outdoors. For the month of September in Vermont, the weather is still good enough. You can be outdoors most of the time. And that way we can start to have that social interaction again where kids are together, but we can be in a much safer environment outdoors. And it would buy us an extra month for everybody to understand what would happen in schools where they didn't choose to do that. But also we would have more time for our plumbers and our HVAC folks to go into the schools and make adjustments to make touchless facilities and better airflow so that if we were to go back into in-person education in say October or even November, our systems would be better in place and the state could have invested in that way. So let me
interrupt you for a second to have a follow-up on that point. You said if I were the governor, I would have talked about this in May. Why couldn't you talk about it as the lieutenant governor? Because maybe you can't legislate as the lieutenant governor, but I read that you've done a lot of initiatives short of legislation. Why couldn't you have talked about that?
Well, I did talk about it some, but one of the issues, and this may be that in Vermont, we're just different than everywhere else, but we were in the early parts of the pandemic and there was a real effort to be collaborative. So while I disagree with the governor on vetoing the minimum wage as he did and paid family leave and a toxics bill that would have held polluters accountable, when it came to the moment of crisis with COVID, that's a time when we do and should come together. And so the governor was choosing the path to go. And even though we had our disagreements and maybe differences of opinion on some of these things, one, I was not in the meetings with the governor and his people to offer ideas. This governor chose 4 years ago to completely keep us separate from each other. We've had literally one face-to-face meeting for 30 minutes in the
Wow.
last 4
Wow.
years. Otherwise, there were a couple of group meetings, and that's very atypical for Vermont, where people of different parties, once you're elected, we tend to work together pretty well, which I know for most people watching this, they're like, that's not possible. It is possible. In Vermont, where it's such a small state, where we all know each other, it's harder to be mean and evil to each other than it is to actually say, okay, what can we do together? Where's the common ground? And do we always agree? Of course not. But it's far more civil and amicable here than what I see in the national scene and in some other states. So anyway, in May, I felt it was important to offer ideas, but not be contentious and fighting with the governor around this pandemic that everybody was concerned about, of all parties, because we didn't need to be divisive at the top when we needed to all be working together to get through those early months of this pandemic. So
Okay, well, I
that might have been the
interrupted.
wrong thing, but that's what I did.
Okay, I interrupted you. You were talking about the economy and giving people checks. Is there anything else you want to address about small businesses, housing,
Well,
foreclosures, evictions, that kind of thing? And
well,
before you address
sure.
the defund the police.
Yeah, we in the legislature passed a number of bills, and the governor also did executive orders to delay foreclosures and evictions and so forth. And we've extended those longer, probably not as perfectly as they should be in terms of truly just saying, not only extended, but you can't just accumulate interest on it either. Like everybody just has to put a freeze. That was not implemented. And I would have looked at whether or not that would have been possible. And I'm sure there would have been some pushback from the bankers and from the wealthier landlords, but ultimately we need to make sure people stay in their homes. I mean, the downstream costs, if you want to look at it purely from a capitalistic perspective, of having many people go homeless and get more sick and all these other issues and mental health challenges, it's just far less costly to society to keep people in their homes. With respect to defund the police, I think Al Sharpton has said it well, and others. First of all, it's not fully defund. Very few people who say defund the police mean eliminate funding, although technically that's what the word would mean. So I have some issues with the choice of word, because I think it really does set a lot of folks who would be supportive into a pushback mentality, because they're like, wait, get rid of police?
Yeah,
That's not safe enough for me.
right.
Um, but really what we're talking about is adjusting, 10, 20, 30% of our police budgets into mental health, affordable housing, the various issues, job creation, investment in BIPOC, owned and started businesses, really looking at our banking structure and why is it that, again, our members of our BIPOC communities have much less access to capital to start businesses. We need to be looking at the foundational challenges that lead to the various types of issues that law enforcement are drawn to. And we need to invest more in mental health. In Vermont, we actually have some counties, and now we're going to expand it statewide, where a mental health worker goes with law enforcement to certain calls, because often it's more of a mental health situation than a criminal situation. And that someone who's trained to help someone who's having a mental health episode or situation, they can often work it back to a peaceful end much better than someone who's trained as a law enforcement officer with 60 hours of firearms training and 4 to 6 hours of community training. So we're looking in Vermont, and we've already passed laws to this effect, to shift the Criminal Justice Training Council so that law enforcement officers' training manuals and training protocols are now reviewed by a much broader subset of society, including mental health workers, including folks from different sets of the community, not just law enforcement. And we are looking at, how do we spend our law enforcement dollars, and can some of those be spent in other ways to de-escalate situations without it being sort of law enforcement mindset in those situations.
Okay, I just have a couple of questions before we end, and one of them involves the race. The governor won his nomination, the Republican primary, so he is going to be your opponent. What are your chances for beating him? And how can people who support you help out?
I appreciate it. I would say it's an uphill battle, which is the better kind of battle to have, frankly, because it motivates people to fight and to go for it and to make it happen. I don't think the hill is as tall as some people say because he's got very high approval ratings for handling of COVID. But 2 years ago, we have elections every 2 years. 2 years ago, in his race for governor and my race for lieutenant governor, I actually got 7,000 more votes than he did. So it's unusual for that to happen, but I start with 7,000 more votes coming off the last election. And then with the 2 years that have since gone by, he's vetoed very important bills to a lot of Democratic and moderate and progressive constituencies that he hadn't done 2 years prior. So a lot of middle and even left-leaning folks gave him a vote of appreciation because he signed a gun bill, the first gun bill in Vermont history. And so people are saying, as a Republican, we should thank him for that. Well, now they're saying we should thank him for COVID, but he's vetoed 2 raises to the minimum wage, which would mean our quote essential workers. I don't know if other states call them essential workers, but frontline workers, grocery store clerks, shelf stockers, the folks that are out there making sure we all have food every day, they're getting paltry wages. He vetoed the minimum wage increase that would have made their pay better. And they're not eligible for hazard pay under the CARES Act because they're not healthcare workers. So that's going to resonate. He has underfunded the state colleges, which were threatened with closing this spring, and he just came out of his budget last week, still $23.8 million short. I had a press conference today about that. And that's in the rural parts of the state. Our state colleges are for working class people to have an opportunity, and we're going to go after that. And we are building momentum. And then with the presidential turnout, we just had record turnout in our primary. It was 30% higher than it's ever been. And the Democratic side had over 100,000 voters, and the Republican side had about 55,000, I think it was. So we're looking at turnout that's very favorable to me as a progressive / Democrat. I run in 2 primaries. I run in the Democratic primary, and I run as a write-in in the progressive primary, and I run under both labels in the general election. And the turnout in the Democratic and progressive primaries combined, way bigger than the Republican. So there's a path to victory that's very clear. It's not going to be easy, but it's doable. And of course, if people want to help, you can go to zuckermanforvermont.com. That's ZUCKERMAN. It's my last name. For, which is FOR, Vermont, but just the VT.com. So ZuckermanFORVT.com. You can check out platform. You can email me questions. You can send financial support. I don't take corporate donations. I just did a Facebook thing today. I said, look, if 1,000 people give me $10, that's $10,000. I mean, it adds up, and that's really helpful in Vermont. Vermont's a very low cost race. It's about a $500,000 race between now and the finish line, compared to these millions of dollars being spent on governorships and Senate races in other parts of the country. So if people can help, that'd be great.
Yes, and I want to reiterate that it's really important to not only think about the presidential race and Congress and the Senate, because these federal races, it's very difficult to make change on that level. But you can see from what David has said that when you're on the state level, and especially in a small state like Vermont, where you get to know your representatives and they work collegially together. Bernie was always known for working collegially with his Republicans when he was mayor of Burlington. People can achieve a lot more change on the state level. I only point you to some Midwestern states where the Republicans had a concerted effort to start with local races. I mean, even as low as school board elections. And lo and behold, now Republicans control the state houses of what were formerly solid Democratic states. And we know them, and some of them are swing states. And this is what, we're worried about, which way they're going to go. So I would encourage people to focus not only when you're running for office, because so many Bernie-crats, we call them Bernie-crats, they want to start, for Congress or even Senate, right. But to focus on these local races and on the state level where you can really make more of a difference. Now, one more question about the campaign. Obviously, it's difficult to do door-to-door canvassing during a pandemic. What are the creative approaches that you've been using to reach people?
Well, there's, it's not super creative to use social media. Sort of everyone's doing that now. We're doing Zoom, living room meetings in different parts of the state. We are doing telephone town halls where people can have these kinds of conversations. We had the first in-person rally in Vermont, and it was I was up on a hay wagon, so I was up over the crowd, and we had cars parked about 10 feet apart. We had about 100 cars. There was an article in something called 7 Days, a Vermont newspaper, that had a drone picture, and it was in a big farm field. And so everybody was spaced out. We had volunteers from the campaign. We had Zucker people doing meeting each line of cars, one Zucker person per line of cars, so we could do contact tracing in case something happened. But we kept spaced out, and that was very innovative. That was the most creative, innovative thing we had done. Got big news, and we had almost 300 people at a rally, which in June was a pretty big deal when COVID was really ravaging the Northeast. And so we did that. I do want to say one thing about the Vermont race that is connected to people all across the country. For anybody who's concerned about the U.S. Senate and the makeup of the Senate, and I know people are contributing to massive millions of dollar races in Maine and Colorado and Kentucky and North Carolina. Vermont has the potential to make or break that tie, not because we have a U.S. Senate race right now, but over the next couple of years, if Biden wins and we're to appoint one of our senators into the administration, and we have a Republican governor, he can't appoint Bernie to anything. He can't appoint Leahy to anything because the Republican governor could flip the Senate with his appointment of the replacement senator. And knock on wood, I don't want anything to happen to our senators, but they're not the youngest folks out there. If over the next couple of years, one of them can't finish their term, that Republican governor, if we end up with a 50-50 tie after this fall, our Republican governor or I could appoint the replacement. And so if you think the U.S. Senate is important and you've been sending $50 and $100 to these U.S. Senate races, in these big states where it's $40 million and your $50 doesn't go anywhere, think about how far $50 goes in Vermont, which is a lot farther in terms of the number of electorate I can reach as a percentage. And think about helping us out here, because a couple $100,000 from across the country would flip this race and make it possible to win. So that's such a small number compared to the bazillions of dollars that the corporate races are running. So help me out if you can.
I really encourage my viewers to donate to you because, I wanted to have you on. I haven't been interviewing a lot of candidates this cycle, but when I read your website, your background, and where you stand on all the issues, I just said, boy, this guy really needs to win. And anything I can do to amplify, your message. And I don't pretend to be an objective journalist. I don't think there is such a thing. I think every journalist brings biases into their reporting, and I just feel more comfortable just putting them right out there. Yet I still think I asked some hard questions. I hope you didn't find them too off-putting.
I've talked about all those issues before, and I welcome any question. I figure people should know whatever the reality is, and you're not going to agree with any of us 100%. I don't always agree with myself 100% of the time. Some bills have good and bad, and one day you say, I'm going to go this way because there's more good, and some days you go, well, there's more bad. Tell me anybody who's always agreed with every decision you've made in your own life, and that happens to us in politics too.
Yep. So my final question is not about you, it's about Bernie. But since you are a good friend of Bernie and you've known him for so long, tell my viewers one thing about Bernie that might surprise them.
Well, I think the perception out there is, he's a grumpy, gruff guy. And I do think he takes his job and the issues that are out there so seriously. And that's why we love him so much. But when he's in a casual setting and he can really just relax, he has a pretty good time and he's got a decent sense of humor. And, I've had opportunities to just sit and laugh with him sometimes. And it's nice to see him relax, which doesn't happen very often, but he does grab time to relax. You saw it on the trail once in a while with him shooting hoops with his family. He does try to relax once in a while.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, David. I wish you a lot of luck in your race. And I want to tell the viewers I will be doing a show next week. I'm not sure what the topic's going to be at this point. I'm sort of on vacation and playing things as I feel like it and as ideas come to me. But if you're just watching me for the first time, you can see all my other shows on my YouTube channel, which is Lauren from LA. You can follow me on Twitter at Lauren_Steiner. And I'm going to close the show the way I always do by saying stay safe, stay home as much as you can, wear your mask, and keep fighting. Thank you.